Hi, I'm here with Mousina, who's our Deputy Chief Economist, a wonderful economist as well. And it's a really interesting time in Australia, and I think a great time to be able to talk to her on some reflections for the year, but also what's coming, because I think it is an interesting period globally, locally. Interest rates appear to be still rising. Unemployment looks like it could go up, and there's a lot of strain out there in the economy. So I'd be really interested, Diana, on your reflections over the last year and what you've seen.
I think a lot of people after the pandemic expected things to be a bit calmer, not as volatile. We had a lot of uncertainty throughout 2020 and over the few years after that. The problem has been, though, that the last year has been extremely volatile in many ways. Inflation has been really high, and a lot of people haven't experienced these levels of inflation before. In Australia, we had 8% inflation year on year. In the last decade, inflation here has averaged about 2%. So it has been this new environment. Interest rates increased a lot faster than what many people were expecting, which is both good and bad for different groups. And I feel like there's been very different outcomes for different consumers and different households, depending on your stage of life and your income, which is often the case. We don't see the same outcomes happening for consumers at the same time. But in the past year, there's been more divergence for outcomes. If you have a mortgage, you'll be feeling the stress right now with rising interest rates. But if you fixed your rate for a long time, maybe you're not feeling those impacts. So there's a lot of different things that are occurring right now. I guess the positive news, because I do want to take a positive view, I tend to be an optimist, is that we have had very good outcomes in Australia in the past few years. And we had a slowdown, obviously, during the pandemic, but we came out of the pandemic in a really strong position, and consumers have been feeling the positives of being out of lockdown. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in, where inflation has been high, because consumers have felt really positive, they felt cashed up, and they wanted to spend their incomes on services. And that's still occurring right now. If we look at things like hotel bookings and restaurant reservations in Australia, those are still holding up really well. And that tells me that there's still some positive in household spending, even though some groups are feeling the stress.
So let's talk about that with household spending, because there has been a bit of a change over the last few months about that spending. You just mentioned services are holding up well, but that's not the case across the whole economy, is it?
Well, over the past few months, we've really seen a slowdown in goods spending and discretionary goods. And I suppose that was always naturally going to happen after the pandemic, where we spent more than we normally would on goods. And how many times can you update your TV or your couch? And we couldn't spend on services, so now we're offsetting all that good spending onto more services. And we're also seeing that slowdown in discretionary spending overall, because household budgets are more constrained now. We've had very high inflation, real wages growth has been negative, so real wages growth is your take-home pay minus inflation. And of course, interest rates have increased, so if you have any sort of debt, then your budget would be constrained by that.
And so you talked about that. Some people are optimistic, you're optimistic, but I know from experience of sitting in our contact centre that some people are also experiencing hardship and difficulty in making ends meet at the moment. As we look forward, I've got to ask the question, tell me about, are we going to have a recession in Australia?
It's not nice to think, yes, we're going to have a recession, of course, but the reality is that the next year will be a tough time for the Australian economy. And we think the risk of a recession is very high. So what does that actually mean for the everyday person? What does a recession look like? As an economist, a recession is defined as 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. So activity going backwards in the economy for 6 months. But you also need to keep in mind what's happening to the unemployment rate. We think the unemployment rate will go up from here, but it's still at quite a low level. So it's currently at 3.6%. That's very low for Australia. That's around nearly a 50-year low. We've had very good outcomes in the labour market. Hours worked has been really high. Underemployment has gone down massively compared to its pre-COVID levels. But we think the unemployment rate will go up from here. It will probably go up to 4 or 4.5% in the next 12 months. So overall, I'd say, well, that actually looks okay, because before the pandemic, the unemployment rate was at 5% or traveling around there. So that is a good outcome. But we think of that risk of the economy going backwards will be extremely high. So how does that look to the everyday person? Some people will unfortunately lose their job and they will have to find new source of employment. We can already see that with a number of layoff announcements around Australia, but also in the US going up quite a lot. On the positive news though, inflation is likely to come down. So that should provide some offset to those constraints to the budget. But the next year will be a tough time for businesses and for consumers. But also keep in mind that economies go through cycles. It's normal to have a rebound in growth like we've had over the past 2 years, where the economy was really strong after the pandemic. And now we're unfortunately coming off those highs. And with interest rates rising as they have in the past year, and with the likelihood that we're going to get more rate rises from here, unfortunately, that is going to put some strain on the economy. Now, maybe a recession is what's needed to get inflation down and for the Reserve Bank to get what it wants. Sometimes, unfortunately, that's just the way that economic cycles happen. But the good news is that I don't think we're going to see massive amount of unemployment. And I don't think that if we do get that recession, it will go on for too long. It might only last for 6 months or for 9 months, but we don't think it will be a period where we're in a recession for a year or longer. I think the Australian economy still has some very positive fundamentals that will keep us from sliding into a deep and long downturn.
Well, I'm glad you ended on an optimistic note there. I'm going to ask you, you're an economist. Sometimes I think it's a bit like pollsters. You have to make predictions and they're not always right. But I'd love to hear your predictions on interest rates, inflation, unemployment, and particularly in interest rates when you see the RBA changing their stance. It's interesting, my daughter has a mortgage and it's coming off fixed rate, and she sent me a text last night. Tell me when interest rates are going to go down, Mum. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll ask Deanna.
Well, we should do this again in 12 months' time to see if the forecasts were right. I think in the near term, interest rates are going to go up from here. Whether it's 2 or 3 hikes, it's hard to be precise with these things because there are a lot of factors at play, obviously, as there always are, but there's probably more at play now than ever because I think the Reserve Bank themselves is more dependent on the data than they usually are because they seem to be also a bit divided as to what to do from here. Should they pause or should they raise rates? And you can see that across other economies as well, like in the US, the central bank there is divided as well on what to do. So interest rates will go up from here. We're currently at a 4.1% cash rate. We think the cash rate will get to 4.6%. A lot of people think it could get to 4.85% or even towards 5%. So expect a few more rate rises from here.
So we're expecting a few more rate rises. Can I give my daughter the answer to when you expect that might turn and come back the other way?
Well, we think we will see interest rate cuts next year. We actually have penciled in about 3 rate cuts in 2024. The Reserve Bank themselves thinks that rate cuts are still a long way off, but they're not always the best guide to forecast either because they, like us, are making their own predictions. Yeah, but I think we will see some rate cuts next year. And if you look at financial markets, they are also expecting that we'll see a few rate cuts next year. On inflation, I think it will come down a lot faster than what people are expecting. Australia's inflation rate peaked at 8%. I think by the end of this year, we'll be close to about 4%. And I think in the beginning of next year, we'll actually be at the top end of the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target band, which is good news for consumers. And a lot of those essential price rises for things like electricity, for fresh food, I think a lot of that inflation will start to come down quite significantly. On the unemployment rate, we think we'll get to a peak of about 4.5%. We're at 3.65%. So a bit of an increase, but again, if you look at it on a historical basis, that's quite a low outcome for Australia.
So a tough cycle, as you said, but it looks like there's some positives on the horizon there and we need to get through this period. Not everyone has a mortgage though, so not everyone is as worried about the interest rates as borrowers might be. What about those retirees who are typically in a different scenario? What do you see happening for them at the moment?
There's a few different factors at play for the retirees. When there's a high inflation environment, as a worker, that tends to be beneficial for you because normally wages sort of keep up with inflation. You don't actually want to see wages running at the same pace of inflation, because that gets you into a situation where you get unsustainable wages growth. And
especially if productivity is not following.
Which is what's happening right now. We've seen quite steep wage rises for minimum wage, award wages, public sector wages. I mean, part of that makes sense because low-income households need to be compensated for the cost of living pressures, but it has created the unfortunate situation where that translates into other parts of the economy where all industries and all employees expect 5, 6, 7% wage gains. Now, for the long run, that is not sustainable. Economists don't like to see wages running at the same pace of inflation. I think wages growth will still rise from here. We think it will peak at about 4% on an annual basis, which is very high relative to where Australia has been the past decade. We've wanted to get wages growth above 2%, and it hasn't gotten above that. So as long as you have wages growth that's between 3 to 4%, but you also have productivity growth, that's okay to meet your inflation target. The problem is now we have very low productivity growth, actually the lowest on record, and wages growth that's rising. So this is what's worrying the Reserve Bank, that we're getting into this cycle. And you can see that happening overseas in places like the UK and the US, where wages growth has gotten to 6 or 7%. And obviously interest rates have risen much more there than they have here. So we need to keep a lid on wages growth if we want to see interest rates eventually come down or at least even pause. So for retirees, it's a bad environment for them when inflation is high because they don't have those wage gains that compensate those inflation rises. But at the same time, for savings rates or for term deposit rates, for bond yields, those have actually gone up quite a lot. So if you're looking for safe investment options in terms of investing in a few-year term deposit or even a cash balance, those savings rates have gone up quite a lot. But that's good news for retirees, but then you also need to think about how the other bits of their portfolios are going. And it's been quite mixed, I'd say.
The market's been up and down over the last period of time.
It has, and unfortunately, Australian shares haven't performed as well as US in the past 6 months. At the beginning of the year, we did see some outperformance for Australia, but a lot of Australian retirees favour Australian assets and shares because you get franking credits and the benefits of those taxes. So there are still some benefits as an Australian investor for Australian shares, but in the next 6 to 12 months, we could see the US outperform because of their very large exposure to the tech sector, which we don't have as large of an exposure to here. And it seems like there's still some momentum behind tech and AI optimism. And Australia could also be held back because commodity prices have started to come down. We have very high exposure to commodities and banks in our share market index. That could pull Australian shares back. So this is just something to keep in mind. It's why it's very important to have a diversified portfolio, especially if you're in a retirement stage where you're relying on a steady stream of income.
And I think for our superannuation customers, the message is, superannuation is a long-term investment. As you said, we go through economic cycles and, it's a period where you need to be a bit resilient, and optimism on the horizon there is what I hear from you.
Yeah, if you look at annual returns to superannuation funds, to share markets, to fixed income products, they go through cycles, they go like this. But on a 30-year time horizon, even on a 20-year time horizon, things are much more stable. So in some ways, you do just need to look through the volatility and look through the noise and just focus on making sure that you're comfortable with your portfolio, with your riskiness. And it really depends on what stage of life that you're in terms of how you want to tailor your asset allocation.
Look, it's a fascinating time around the world, and I thank you very much for your time. I think, as we look out there in Australia, there are clearly a lot of people who are doing it tough at the moment. We need to acknowledge that. But I think what you're saying is if we look through 24, there really is some green shoots on the horizon. And for now, it's about, sticking with the philosophies that we all know work.
Yeah, I think the next 6 to 12 months will still be tough for the Australian economy overall. But as we said, there'll be different people who experience different things. But in a long run, Australia is a great economy. We have a lot of positives. We have a very strong export market still to our Asian neighbours. We have a very well capitalized and strong financial system. And there are still a lot of opportunities around our services economy. So I'm optimistic on the growth rate of Australia. But one thing that we need to do as a nation is to lift our productivity growth, which goes, so there are definitely things that we can
Let's finish on a positive. There's great things ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lex.